2024 electronic meeting of the Environmental Commission. We will conduct this meeting like an in-person meeting, so during roll call, please indicate your location. Public comment is welcome and will be via telephone only. To speak a public comment, call 888-788-0099. Enter meeting ID 962-0336-6543. This information is available on the published agenda and the public notices section on the city's website, and broadcast of this meeting on CTN Channel 16, AT&T Channel 99, and online at a2gov.org/watchctn. Aaron, will you read the land heritage statement?
Oh, sorry, we're not doing that in public.
We'll get that later.
But I did want to confirm, is caller 673, is that Commissioner Gruber? Okay, I'm going to assume that's her. Okay. That's not Commissioner Gruber. I will.
Hi, yeah. Yep, that's me.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, yes, land heritage statement. I acknowledge that the land the city of Ann Arbor occupies is the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Anishinaabe, including Odawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi and Wyandot peoples. I further acknowledge that our city stands, like almost all property in the United States, on lands obtained, generally in unconscionable ways, from indigenous peoples. The taking of this land was formalized by the Treaty of Detroit in 1807. Knowing where we live, work, study, and recreate does not change the past, but a thorough understanding of the ongoing consequences of this past can empower us in our work to create a future that supports human flourishing and justice for all individuals.
Okay, Aaron, will you do the roll call?
Yes. Councilmember Ackman.
Here, Ann Arbor.
Vice Chairperson Brown let us know he was absent today. Commissioner Curtis.
Here, Ann Arbor.
Commissioner Dale is absent. Councilmember Dish.
Here, Chicago.
Commissioner Graham.
Here, Ann Arbor.
Commissioner Gruber.
Here in Seattle.
Commissioner Marson is absent, I believe, today, as is Commissioner Mirsky. Commissioner Mitchell.
Here in Ann Arbor.
Commissioner Nedrich.
Here in Ann Arbor.
Commissioner Wahing.
Here in Ann Arbor.
I haven't updated my roll call sheet, but Commissioner Peters-Wood.
Here, Ann Arbor.
Okay. And Commissioner Smith. Absent. Okay. And let's see, I believe we have a quorum, correct?
Yes.
Okay, we have a quorum. Thank you.
So does anyone want to make changes to the agenda? If not, is there a motion to approve the agenda?
I think Rita had a small change. Oh, Rita had a Commissioner Mitchell had a small change in one, which I'll make, and then
It wasn't to
update.
the agenda, though.
That was the meeting minutes.
Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you. Getting ahead of myself.
It's okay.
So I think, is it all in favor of the agenda, of approving the agenda, say aye or raise your hand?
Aye.
Aye, okay. Okay, for the minutes, Commissioner Mitchell had a small change for the June one. Ann Marson was in attendance for that, and there was a spelling error also in there. So besides that, are there any other changes to the June meeting minutes? Is there a motion to approve the meeting minutes? Couple of people there. One will be second. All in favor of approving the minutes, the June meeting minutes, say aye or raise your hand.
Aye.
Okay, for the July meeting minutes, any changes to those? Is there a motion to approve them? And seconded? Okay. All in favor of approving the July meeting minutes? Looks like most. Okay. All right, what's next? So public comment. Next item of business is public comment. This is an opportunity for people to speak for up to 3 minutes. Please call 888-788-0099. Either enter meeting ID 962-0336-6543. To raise your hand, press 9. To unmute, press *6. City staff will select callers who have raised their hand one by one using the last 3 digits of your phone number. When speaking, please move to a quiet area, state your name and address at the beginning of your comments. There may be a delay up to 30 seconds before a connection is established. Aaron, do we have any callers?
Yes, we do. Oh, no, I'm sorry. That's Commissioner Gruber again. No
Okay.
additional callers.
Okay, so I think the next was the unfinished business, which was a debrief of our working session for last month. And I made a few notes, and if other people want to add comments, feel free to at the end. I thought it was very nice to see everybody in 3D. I don't think this commission has done that, at least since I've been on it and since most people have been on it. We spent most of the time talking about each of the 3 working groups. We adjusted the members of the working groups based on availability and interest. We changed the work group leaders. Circular economy is now Steve Brown, and water quality is now Sarah Nedrich. We discussed key accomplishments in each one of the work groups last year, and also future tasks for the work groups, realizing the tasks need to be flexible and to accommodate whatever the city staff's ability to support would be. Also, as prep work for the working meeting, we filled out a survey of different environmental issues we would like to address and pursue. We didn't really have a lot of time to talk about those in detail, but we did pass those on to the working groups to look at as they start looking about their work for next year. But we also had a general caution of don't try and do too much. It's better to do fewer tasks and actually finish a task as opposed to take on lots of tasks and finish next to nothing. Are there other specific comments people wanted to make from our working group session? If not, I think we move on to new business, right? So the first one is a presentation from Mike Cost. So Mike, thank you for coming. And Aaron, are you going to run the slides, or do you want Mike to do it?
Yeah, either I can make Mike, or Mike, do you see an option to share? I think I might have to make you a co-host.
Let me see. I think I do have an option. So
Oh, okay.
let me see
Sure.
if that works.
Okay.
Did it work? Yeah, looks like it worked for
Okay.
you guys, right? You can
Yes,
see.
it's working.
All right, great. Thank you for the opportunity to talk today. I'll be focusing on forest conservation. And I just, this slide, you can see it's beautiful, right? Nichols Arboretum, 2009. Pretty impressive. And I'm going to show another version of this, but it's going to be much smaller. So this is that second week in May when trillium flowers. And if you happen to be a bumblebee coming out looking for some pollen, we got you covered, right? I mean, that's a lot of pollen available if you need pollen, or if you're a caterpillar, you need some trillium, because a lot of insects, most insects are host specialists. So if you're an insect that specializes in this flower, we got you covered. So that isn't the case always, but it was in 2009. So I just wanted to point that out there. So Michigan has lots of forest, historically had lots of forest. This is vegetation circa 1800. This is a good hypothesis based on information that was collected by the land surveyors. In the northern part of the state, you've got beech and sugar maple mixed with conifers in the green, hemlock and white pine and cedar and balsam fir. And then those brown colors are oak and pine. So it could be pine barrens or oak pine barrens or oak pine forests, like a white oak, white pine forest. Southern Michigan, the pink colors. The darker one is beech sugar maple forest. So it's like the northern, but it's missing those conifers. And then the brighter pink color is oak hickory forest. The lighter colors are that savanna, oak savanna. So really not with pines, but oak savanna, oak barrens, oak savanna. If we look closer at Ann Arbor, and that's that circled area, that bright pink that stands out, that's oak hickory forest. So this is white oak, black oak, red oak forest, and mixed with hickories like pignut hickory and bitternut hickory and shagbark hickory. The darker brown is what we call mixed oak forest, or it's a drier oak forest, and it's usually lacking red oak, but lots of white oak and black oak and pignut hickory. And then the tan colored are oak barrens. Now, fire was a critical component, especially in southern Michigan, and in supporting these oak ecosystems. And the savannas are pretty much dependent, and the oak hickory forest and oak forests are pretty much dependent on the prevalence of fire, which was set by Native Americans for lots of different reasons. So the Anishinaabe were actively managing the land to bring in game and increase berry crop, and for a variety of reasons, they were conducting fires on a regular basis to make the land more passable, more palatable to animals that they hunted and plants that they were gathering. So it worked out really well for them. But when they were forcibly moved from the land, we saw some big changes, and we saw maples come in, and we talk about that in a minute. But oaks were one of the dominant features here. So if you look, it's all about oak in Washtenaw County pretty much. And oaks are a keystone species. They were a keystone species. They're still a keystone species. And hopefully they'll be still keystone species in the future, because they're supporting so many other species. And what is a keystone species? What we're talking about is a species that by its presence really influences the other species, their distribution and abundance. And one of the ways oaks do this is by supporting songbirds, because they support all these caterpillars. They support over 900 caterpillars in North America, 450 different species in the Ann Arbor region. And that's just critically important to songbirds, because 96% of songbirds are insectivorous, especially during the breeding season. They're gathering, and what kind of insects are they eating? They're really looking for these caterpillars. That's mainly what they're eating, and they're little protein packets full of carotenoids, which boost their immune system. So that's what's so important. 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars it takes to raise a clutch of chickadee eggs. Like, that's crazy, right? It's hard to believe, but where are they getting those? They're getting those from the plants. These are caterpillars. What are caterpillars eating? Plants. What kind of plants? They're eating native plants. They're not eating the non-native. They're not eating the invasive plants. They're eating the native plants, and oaks just happen to be supporting the most number. So they're critical. We also know that that's what many of the other invertebrates are eating, and the vertebrates, 100 different species of vertebrates, like from wood ducks and geese to raccoons to deer to turkeys and so on, and blue jays and so on and so forth. And then lots of insects are utilizing those, and beetles are utilizing all of the other, from the leaf litter to the leaves to the stems to the twigs, and so on and so forth. So they're critical to biodiversity, oaks are. But they are experiencing some difficulties. They're not reproducing well at all. I mean, we did surveys in the Arb Forest last couple of years, and we found only a couple. We found the first year we found 14 oak saplings in the whole frickin' forest, 50 acres. That's crazy. And the seedlings are being eaten by deer. The saplings that we found were like, the saplings we found, 100% of the white oaks were being gnawed on by deer, 50% of the red oaks, or 70% rather of the red oaks. So anyway, we've got some issues. And one of the issues is maples. Maples have come into this forest, and they're not fire adapted. They're not fire adapted. So when Native Americans were burning on a regular basis, we didn't have a crop of maples coming under the oaks. But when the Anishinaabe were forcibly removed from the land, the practice of fire was no longer common. what happened is the maples came in and now they're getting large. We have some big maples and they create a really different canopy. They create too much shade for the oaks to reproduce. And this is an oak forest, and all the green you're seeing at eye level is red maple leaves. And that's really typical of our oak forest. The oaks that are over in the overstory and the understory and the young trees are all maples, and they create a lot of shade and it prevents oak regeneration. So what's the problem with that? Well, oaks are really critical for biodiversity. And when I say biodiversity, I'm not talking about only this species. I'm talking about the genes within that species, maintaining genetic diversity, species diversity, ecosystem diversity, or a diversity of natural communities. We need a diversity of ecosystems. So biodiversity covers that. When we say biodiversity, we're thinking about ecosystem diversity and functional diversity, from natural processes like fire and wind throw, and hydrology and the biogeochemical processes like the nitrogen cycle and the water cycle and so on and so forth. So we need all these things to be functional. We need it in balance. When things get out of balance, that's problematic. These ecosystems evolve together for very long periods of time. But what we've been seeing, and we know this, you all are well aware of this, is partly probably why you're involved in the Environmental Commission, because you're concerned about this, because we are experiencing this massive loss of biodiversity. Scientists are calling it the Anthropocene, rather than this period being the geologic period of the Holocene, where it's being renamed to the Anthropocene by many scientists. And we're in the sixth greatest extinction, sixth mass extinction on the planet. We see massive losses of plants and vertebrates and invertebrates and vertebrates, insects, birds, and mammals and so forth. So birds are interesting because we've lost over 3 billion birds from the 1970s. And what I think is really interesting is how we know that. It's Doppler radar. We have been doing Doppler radar, making these recordings for many years of the night skies, and we never had the computing power that we do now to be able to see what was in the air. And now we look at those tapes and we can see there were mass migrations of birds. And we know there were today, when we compare the records, the Doppler radar of what's in the sky then in the 70s and what's now, we see a loss of 3 million birds. So why birds? There's birds can move around. I mean, of all the species you would expect to be okay, it would be birds. What do birds eat? Birds eat insects. And what do insects rely on? They rely on the native plants. Native plants are key because the plants and animals in any given area, they evolve together. So they co-evolved, and a lot of insects, as I said earlier, they're specialists. Most insects are specializing on a group of plants, a genus or a family. And if our native plants are taking a hit, then our insects are taking a hit. And if our insects are taking a hit, then it just cascades, because the bigger animals are either eating animals that eat plants, or they're eating plants directly. And the ones that are eating animals that eat plants, a lot of those are eating insects. A lot of it is the base of that food chain are the plants, and then the insects, and then everybody else. Goldenrods, you all know goldenrods. They're in bloom right now. They're absolutely gorgeous. They're lighting up our fields. They support 135 different species of caterpillars in the Ann Arbor area, the most of any other herbaceous plant. They're essentially the oaks of the herbaceous plants, and lots of specialist pollinators and other specialist insects. So they're the base of the food chain. And when they go out, then when our native plants go out, then our insects go out, and it just cascades. So I can't say enough about the importance of maintaining a diversity of native plants. The reasons for biodiversity loss, I think we're all well aware. It's habitat loss. And in Michigan, we've lost 50% of our wetlands, some places 80%, and that would be in the southeast Michigan. Invasive species are a problem. For forest, we've lost in southern Michigan, 2/3 of our forest. We've lost 700,000 acres of forest in southern Michigan. And the way it works primarily is what you're seeing pictured here. It's somebody builds a subdivision, then someone adds to it, then someone adds to it, and then someone adds to it. And what's left are these really small blocks of forest. That's why I mentioned forest fragments. And it's not something that happens all at once, right? It's incrementally. Someone in the 1950s or 40s or 30s or so on and so forth. It just keeps happening and happening. But its impacts are cumulative. It's a death by 1,000 cuts. It's not a one-time thing, it's a series. And everybody's like, oh, just a little bit more. Oh, just a little bit more until someone takes the last piece of the pie. So the impacts are cumulative, and we see this in Berkshire, England, and that's what's pictured there. But from lots of forest to very little forest, and this has been the effects of this have been really well studied over many years, and still today is being studied. It has this long list, and I'm not going to go through all these effects, but when you take a forest and you break it up, you end up with very different climates from the interior, what it had, to the edge, or what it has now on the edge versus the interior. And if it's small enough, it just really becomes all edge, and it's all the similar climate. Edge species like deer and raccoon and cowbirds and many other species that are very common on the edge, but not in the forest interior normally, but they just increase in abundance, and that we end up with a loss of songbirds and nesting and ground nesting songbirds. And it's problematic in many ways, this forest fragmentation. But I don't want to diminish the importance of forests. Even when they're small, they're still really important. They provide these great ecosystem services. They produce oxygen and reduce air pollution and greenhouse gases. They sequester carbon, slow global warming, reduce urban temperatures, prevent soil erosion, reduce runoff and water pollution, promote water infiltration. They're a place where the groundwater can recharge those tree roots. The roots of the plants are channels that water goes down to recharge aquifers. So they're critically important to protect, even, regardless of the reduced capacity that they might have if they were in a big block of forest. Even the small forests are critically important, and especially the big trees. We used to think in ecology that the small trees sequestered, they grow fast, and we thought they were all the rage, all important. Well, that's not true. It's the large trees, all those leaves, that huge stem, they're sequestering most of the carbon. The bigger it is, the more carbon it's sequestering, the longer it's sequestering that. And they're actually putting on biomass. They're putting on more biomass than a small tree because they've got so much space. So protecting large trees is critically important. We also know that they have great benefits to humans, like they reduce stress, they reduce heart rate, they reduce blood pressure, they bolster mental health and help reduce crime rates and violence. They promote physical healing, they promote physical activity, they promote social interaction. We see each other on trails, we go outside and we see one another on trails. They make cities more beautiful. They make cities more livable. So they're critically important. And even with their, even small woodlots are critically important to biodiversity. They provide habitat for plants and animals and fungi and lichen and moss and soil microbes and so on and so forth. They support complex food webs, and they serve as biological reservoirs for repopulating local extirpated species. What am I talking about? Well, what we know from science studying different areas, that they don't stay the same, and we have local extinctions that happen. Like you're not hearing, my windows are open, and 2 years ago and for many years before that, you would be hearing tree frogs. At this time of night, this time of year, you'd be listening to tree frogs. I can hear the crickets, you might hear them too, but you're not hearing tree frogs. And I know because I do recordings here, because I teach an evening class, and there's on my background, there was always tree frogs, and there's not tree frogs anymore. So why aren't there tree frogs? Well, last year there was a drought. There's a little forested wetland across the street, a little pond across the street from my house, forested. And last year there was a drought in June, and it must have been a bad time because dried up all the pond, the little pond where the tree frogs normally nest, where they lay their eggs. So this year, no tree frogs. That's a local extirpation, right? There's still tree frogs plenty in Michigan, but not in my now, not across the street from me, not at my house anymore. So this idea that you have these local extinctions, but they can be recolonized. If there was another woodlot with another pond nearby, it could be recolonized, and hopefully it will be recolonized, and I'm sure it will. At least I'm hopeful. But that theory of where species blink out locally, that's called island biogeography, and it's really been studied. And what they were looking at is islands that are really bit next to a mainland, and then little islands further out and more isolated. The farther out, the more isolated, the less species. The closer in, the more chances of recolonization. And isolated preserves, isolated areas suffer the most because they don't have the ability to colonize. And this theory has been used for conservation planning for many years now. That theory was put forth by MacArthur and Wilson back in '67. And since that time, it's been adopted by conservation planners to think about reserve design. And you can do this in the city of Ann Arbor. You can do this yourselves. Think about your parks and university lands with forests on them, and private lands with forests on them, corporations. All of those are essentially serving as preserves, if you would. And reserve design says that the bigger the reserve, the better. And if you had a chance to buy, let's say 500 acres versus 4 100-acre parcels, you'd probably be better with 500 acres because it's going to have more diversity of habitats, more species, and larger populations of species such that they may be able to withstand those local extirpations. They can colonize maybe right from within the woodlot itself. But if you had to divide it up, you'd want to have them close together so that you could get this migration between woodlots. And there could be a bee carrying pollen, could be a bird with a seed stuck to it, or it could be a species that can move, that can actually move between these spots. And if you had the chance, you'd want to connect them with corridors. So, and it doesn't have to necessarily be a pristine corridor. It just has to be a way for species to move unimpeded between these preserves, or at least try to get there. And native plants in people's yards could make a big difference for pollinators to be able to move between preserves, because pollinators, they can fly and they can go from one patch to the other. If there's food there, they'll come. And that's really important. And planting oaks in yards and maintaining oaks is really critical for the birds and for the insects. Reserve shape is important. Thinking about like these long linear strips are great for corridors, not so good for core preserves, but having a round or a square would be better because it has less edge. And then buffer zones, it could be a different natural community, could be an old field, but having natural areas bordering your higher quality areas is really important, even if they're just an old field that nobody's doing with. In other words, it doesn't have to be managed pristinely, but if there's not a buffer land, that's great. So I mentioned keystone species, and when one species is super abundant, it becomes a keystone species if it's large enough to affect other species, and that's what we see with deer. Deer at high numbers become keystone species, and that the top photo there is the one I showed you earlier. It's that arb with lots of beautiful trillium, and 2009. And the lower one I took in 2016. And there's a huge difference. Like I said earlier, if you're an insect coming out and looking for pollen, we got you covered in 2009. You're pretty much out of luck in 2016. You can see 1 trillium here, 1 trillium at a base of a tree, another one at the base of a tree where deer don't eat. Yeah, there's a few trillium, but they're pretty much gone, and they should be there because that's the time of year, and there are a couple in flower. So deer at high numbers, then they're competing with other animals for limited resource like acorns and wildflowers. Like the pollinators are competing with the deer, but the deer eat the plants. The pollinators are just grabbing some pollen to keep their young alive. So deer are altering the habitat. They're altering the distribution of trees, shrubs, and herbaceous plants. They're certainly altering the abundance of young oaks in these forests. And that has cascading effects then, as I've been saying, on the insects and birds and other animals. The good news is the call, that made a huge difference. The call ended in 2020. That was the last year of the call. In 2022, we began to see in the same forest, this was I must be like within 25 feet of where the first picture was taken. And the deer call was amazing because in 2022, 2 years later, we started seeing trillium come back. This is this spring, same week, it was May 9th, and there are all these trillium. So that's really good news because that's not the case at all the preserves. I'm worried about one of our preserves we manage at Horner Woods where we're not doing any call. And if you keep eating that plant long enough, you're going to exhaust the root supply. It'll resprout, but it's smaller leaves. You'll exhaust it. So it's great to see, the trillium coming back at the arb after the call. And to conclude, forest fragments in Ann Arbor are an invaluable resource for all of life, humans and animals. Preventing further fragmentation and loss is critically important to future generations. Maintaining biodiversity, it requires active management. We can't just like have these beautiful forests and with hiking trails and use them only for that. They have to be managed. And to do so, that would include managing deer, because at high numbers, deer really have a huge impact on other species. So management would include management for deer. And that would also help the native plants, the oaks, as well as the native plants. So, thank you for the opportunity to talk. I'm going to turn it over to Jacqueline. I think we'll probably answer questions when she's done. So, or have conversation now.
Hi, thanks, Mike. Thank you all for the opportunity to talk to the Environment Commission about deer impacts. And I'm going to also talk about the monitoring I conducted for the city from 2015 to 2020. I have a lot of information on my slides, so I'm going to just really summarize them, knowing that you have handouts and you'll be able to go back and read and review if you like. Mike mentioned that deer are considered a keystone species in ecological terms, as well as a trophic cascades, and I'll focus mostly on that. But first, I wanted to zoom out a little bit to offer a broad overview of deer impacts in cities, including public health and safety considerations, as well as effects on planted landscapes before I get to natural areas. As a prelude, I'll zoom out even more. I'm sorry, I should minimize that. There you go. As a prelude, I'll zoom out even more to give you a whirlwind history of white-tailed deer in Michigan that will suggest why deer might be a problem. Before European settlement, as Mike mentioned, Native Americans managed the landscape with prescribed burns, and they also hunted deer. Researchers have estimated that there were on average 1 to 2 deer per square mile, obviously in clumps, but then widely spaced, compared to more than 30 deer per square mile in much of lower Michigan today, with even higher numbers in some parks. Overhunting of deer by European settlers in the 1800s for meat and hides led to dramatic population decline, so that by the 1870s, deer were mostly eliminated from southeastern Michigan. Local areas started imposing hunting limits in the 1860s, and by the end of the century, the state stepped in to restrict hunting more broadly. At the same time, various predator species that controlled deer populations plummeted with bounty hunting and changes in land use. Deer started making a comeback, and then at the same time, the DNR started managing habitat for deer. And I'm sorry, I think I skipped a couple of slides here. Deer start reproducing at a young age and often have twins, so populations can grow very quickly. A pioneering study at the University of Michigan's George Reserve in Livingston County tracked a deer population that grew from 6 individuals brought into a 2-mile square fence that grew to 222 deer in just 6 years in the 1930s. This experiment was repeated in the 1970s and results were similar. When deer populations get high and dense without predators to control them, deer are susceptible to starvation and to disease, such as chronic wasting disease. As deer populations grew, there was also a growing recognition of the deer impacts, with studies starting in the 1930s and 40s showing that deer were linked to declines in tree seedling survival and thus forest regeneration. The growing recognition of deer impacts prompted shifts at some points in time to management, from management for deer to management of deer. That is, attempts were made to change hunting regulations with the aim of controlling deer overpopulation and limiting their impacts. Land use changes have further affected deer habitat. Suburbs actually offer ideal edge habitat, a mix of forest patches with open fields, lawns, and gardens. Often those are well watered and well fertilized, where deer can thrive with no predators and no hunting. With that background in mind, let's turn and look at deer impacts. In cities and suburbs, many residents focus on public health and safety, and in particular, deer vehicle collisions and tick-borne diseases such as Lyme disease. Michigan ranked third in the nation in 2021 for deer vehicle collisions, with over 50,000 collisions that year, and they have been reported annually for each of the past several years. I couldn't find more recent data mapped like this. Last year, there were 73 deer vehicle collisions in Ann Arbor, and thanks to Bernie for capturing this map. While deer vehicle collisions affect people, it's important to keep in mind the effects that they have on deer, likely claiming the lives of 2.5% of the estimated deer population of Michigan, which was 2 million in 2022. Another public health and safety concern in Michigan is the increasing incidence of Lyme disease, which is carried by the black-legged or deer tick. The ticks have other hosts, but deer are the largest and travel the farthest. While the Lyme story is complex and multifactorial, key researchers have found that reducing deer numbers can reduce tick populations and Lyme incidence. Lyme disease has been expanding in Michigan since 1998 and is now found through much of southern lower Michigan. The lower chart shows the increase of Lyme in Washtenaw County, and that bar on the far right is the bar for 2024. So, of course, we don't have all the data for 24 yet. I myself had a positive Lyme test from a deer picked up in an Ann Arbor park this spring. In addition to public health and safety, planted landscapes are another concern. Urban deer can damage plantings in public parks and cemeteries, including native plant and pollinator gardens, as well as community gardens, making it hard to grow plants unless you're willing to invest in a lot of fencing. And many Ann Arbor residents have noted damage on their landscape plants, including their native plants and their pollinator gardens. And keep in mind that private as well as public gardens, especially those with native plants and trees, have those public values that Mike described. They offer beauty, habitat, biodiversity. They filter noise and dust, moderate weather, sequester carbon, and benefit our mental health. With that broad brush overview of other impacts, let's focus on natural areas. An initial question is, where are the deer in Ann Arbor and how many are there? You can find deer count data from 2015 to 2020 on the City Deer Management website. Deer vehicle collision data, which provide another indicator, are also shown on this site. This is not a complete map, but you can see that deer are concentrated in the northwest and in the northeast parts of the city along the Huron River, and then extending to the south of the Huron as well. There are some pockets also in Ward 3 and 4. How are all those deer affecting our natural areas? They're affecting natural areas at every level, from trees to wildflowers to ecological communities, including pollinators, such as birds and bees and butterflies. And they're also affecting ecological processes, such as forest regeneration and the maintenance of biodiversity. This broad importance across many levels is why deer have been called keystone species or keystone herbivores. Hundreds of species over the past 25 to 30 years have shown that overabundant deer are affecting our plant communities, leading to declining tree regeneration, decreased abundance, reproduction, and diversity of wildflowers, and declines and disappearances of sensitive species, notably orchids, but also many spring wildflowers. And keep in mind that forests are more than just trees. 85% of forest plant diversity is composed of shrubs and wildflowers and herbs that supply food to pollinators and birds. How do deer exert these impacts? Well, to start with, deer eat plants, a lot of them. A single deer eats 7 to 12 pounds of plants per day, the amount shown in this garbage bag. Deer are generalists, eating leaves and twigs, flowers and fruits, and of many different species, and they can also damage and kill shrubs and small trees with their antler rubs. Deer damage can kill plants outright or can make them susceptible to drought, disease, and insect pests. Damage can also reduce the growth and slow or prevent reproduction. This bonsai oak tree is probably 25 to 30 years old, and it might never get tall enough to escape deer browsing. Effects on individual plants build to impacts on populations and whole species. For example, spring flora species such as Trillium need to grow for 7 to 15 years before they gain enough resources to bloom for the first time. Then if the deer eat the flowers and leaves, it may be several years before they can bloom again. If deer eat enough flowers in a population, there will be little reproduction, with fewer new plants to replace the old, and whole populations can decline or disappear from a site, along with their specialist population or pollinators or fruit eaters. And when they disappear from enough sites, the species as a whole can decline. So again, deer indirectly affect pollinators by reducing the flowers, and they affect the birds by reducing flowers and fruit as well as nest sites. And they further affect the birds by eating the oak seedlings that grow into oak trees that support insects that the birds eat. So that is what is meant by being a keystone herbivore. Deer are affecting whole food webs. And when deer eat the plants and reduce their abundance, flowering and fruiting, it's not just the plants, but the suite of insects and spiders and ants that eat on those plants. And that in turn provide food for many species of forest songbirds. And Mike has told you about the declines that we're seeing in forest songbirds. With that general overview of impacts, let's look at the monitoring that my team and I conducted in Ann Arbor natural areas. We use 3 major methods: red oak experimental or sentinel seedlings, a Trillium exclosure study with existing populations of Trilliums in paired plots with half fenced and half left unfenced, accessible to deer, and experimental plantings of wildflowers, again with half fenced and half unfenced. Here's an overview of where we monitored with the different methods. A total of 15 sites with the red oak sentinels and 5 sites each for Trillium and wildflowers. Let's start by looking at the oaks. How much did the deer browse? They browsed a lot, more than 40% of red oak seedlings at all but one site. The red line shows the 15% level above which deer browse levels are considered too high to allow for successful oak regeneration. Deer were managed at some of these sites, but not others. And I'll talk later about how we can assess the effectiveness of the deer management. But even with management, these levels were high. And if deer browse continues at these high levels, oaks, which are the dominant species in our forest, but are struggling to regenerate, as Mike described, will face further struggles. And just a reminder that those oaks support hundreds of species of insects, including many caterpillars that are key foods for forest songbirds. Now let's look at Trilliums. Where have all the flowers gone? You've seen this slide, this pair of slides from Mike already. I actually think this was my photo of after I started research. And because I used a marked tree, you can see the crooked tree that's in the middle of the lower photo is also the tree that's in that upper one. You can see there are hardly any blossoms after that period of 7 years. Similar patterns have been observed in many parks, not only in Ann Arbor, but throughout the Northeast and Midwest. So that forest ecologist Tom Rowinski has referred to this as scentless spring. It can be hard to notice deer damage, though. A casual look at this monitoring plot suggests that there are a reasonable number of trilliums, the plants with 3 leaves, although none have flowers. But when you look carefully, you can see that many stems have been browsed by deer, a total of 27 deer browse stems compared to 12 unbrowsed. And deer generally browse the larger plants that have buds or flowers. So without deer browse, this plot might have had quite a few flowers. This figure shows the percent of trilliums that bloomed in the fence plots, those are the green bars, versus the unfenced deer accessible plots, the orange bars. With deer management over time, the green and orange bars should converge. You can see that even after 3 full growing seasons of protection from deer, the fenced trilliums have mostly recovered, especially at the Arboretum. That recovery has been particularly notable. However, recovery has been slow at Bird Hills, and I'll circle back around to talk about that. Researchers have suggested that flowering rates lower than 30%, indicated by that red dashed line, suggests that deer management is needed. So when you look at those orange bars, it looks like further deer management is needed in those sites. And one of those sites is not being managed. Now let's look at experimental wildflowers. I planted a dozen different species of wildflowers, but I'll focus on asters and goldenrods because they provide key resources for pollinators in late summer and fall, and because they survived transplanting to field conditions in sufficient numbers for analysis. Where have all the flowers gone? Well, those forest wildflowers, a lot of them have been eaten by deer. This is data from 2019, the final year of monitoring of these wildflowers. You can see that at all sites except Black Pond Woods, there were many fewer flowers in the deer accessible unfenced plots, the light purple bars, compared to the fenced plots protected from deer, the dark purple bars. In 3 sites, deer accessible plots had only 11 to 20% as many flowers as plots protected from deer. And if you are concerned about pollinator declines and where all the bees are going, my monitoring found that when there are fewer flowers, there are fewer pollinators. The fenced plots are shown, protected from deer, are shown in gold, while the unfenced deer accessible plots are shown in orange. This is evidence that deer are indirectly affecting pollinators. Ecologists refer to these types of impacts on different levels of a food web as a trophic cascade. How effective was deer management? That is a full presentation in and of itself. So I'll just discuss a couple of examples. With the wildflowers that I just showed you, deer management was effective in closing the gap from 2017 to 2019 between fenced plots with the solid line and unfenced plots, the dotted line, at Black Pond Woods on the top left. This is a site where deer were effective, or where a lot of deer were removed. The lower right chart shows Furstenberg, where deer were not managed near the monitoring plots until after the collection of the final data shown here. And I'm realizing I should have moved this bar, but never know where to put it. You can see that the gap between fenced plots and unfenced plots was increasing over time, suggesting the need for management. How effective was, the Trillium data add another layer to the story. At Bird Hills on the upper left, Trillium recovery has been slow, even in the fenced plots protected from deer, which have not even quite reached 30% blooming rates. One reason might be that Trillium are a lagging indicator. It takes years for recovery to happen. And Mike showed you the pictures of the Arboretum plots in 2022 and 2024, several years after deer management. So monitoring really should continue for longer. At Lakewood, the lower plot on the right, there has not been deer management to date, and there is an increasing gap between fenced and unfenced plots. I'd be happy to discuss recommendations for future monitoring, primary among them a closer coordination between monitoring and deer management areas, and also a longer monitoring time. And I was asked about whether deer management is being done elsewhere. Here's a list of various communities and parks in southern lower Michigan that have worked on the issue. The DNR has convened a statewide management advisory commission and is developing recommendations even now. Keep in mind that predators play a vital role in ecosystems, and short of reintroducing predators, we need to think carefully about whether or how people could play that role. I'm happy to take questions now or by email. I've included a number of extra slides that expand on different aspects of this, but I know that time is limited. And I just wanted to conclude by noting the help of various people on this project. Science is a group activity, and I was assisted by many, many people. I appreciate funding from the City of Ann Arbor and from the Nichols Arboretum.
Well, thank you, Jacqueline. So who would like to ask the first question? I'm sure some people have questions. Sure, go ahead, Councilmember Dish. You're muted.
Yeah, I was trying to find my unmute button. So this is Rich. Thank you both for this really, really important information. I wanted to ask first about, well, I want to ask about fencing. So fencing is a form of deer management. How comprehensive is your fencing in our public parks? I mean, how much does that alone help us apart from culling? I'm not taking a stand against culling, I'm just asking. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about Bird Hills.
To start with, fencing, my plots are quite small. They're just 1 or 2 square yards. Fencing is expensive. I was under a lot of constraints to keep the cost down, but if you really want to fence large areas to keep deer out, the standard recommendation is that your fences be 8 feet tall. However, having worked in a number of areas with 8-foot fences, that is not adequate. You really need a 10-foot fence. And in order to install 10-foot fences, you need pretty solid fence posts. And fences take constant maintenance. Every single year, I had trees or branches fall down on some of these fences. So constantly coming in to repair them. And a final point is, if you're thinking about public spaces, many people find there's a real visual barrier to have, little fences everywhere. But if you're talking about doing a full perimeter fence, that's a cost, and you need to think about your entry points. So those are just a few considerations about fencing. On private properties, a lot of people are exploring electric fence and various strands of electric fence. That's probably not something you want to do in public spaces. Talking about Bird Hills, I wonder if you could tell me more specifically what your questions are there.
Yeah, first, thank you for your response on fencing. I know that might have sounded like an obvious thing, but when we hear from some advocates that don't like deer management, fencing is often what they recommend. And I am always thinking, how do we use fencing in a public park? So just thank you for putting that on the record. You had a slide where you showed that I think it was the trillium rebound in Bird Hills was lower than in any of the other areas for your enclosures. And I thought you mentioned that you could say more about that. Does anybody remember the point that I'm fuzzily remembering here?
Right. So I did try with that second slide to point that out, that even with management, there has not been a large recovery, but even inside those fences, the trillium recovery has been very slow. And that gets back to that point I tried to make, that trillium, because of their life history, because they need 7 to 15 years to grow to bloom the first time. And then if they get browsed heavily, those plants are really set back and they might need years and years to be able to grow and bloom again. And so what I think we're seeing is a real lag time there that just suggests that long-term heavy impacts, we can start to recover from them, but it can take some time.
Okay, so I
You
think
have some new data that I haven't analyzed yet because I've continued to volunteer to monitor there. But I haven't had the resources to dig into that data, but it's certainly something that I could look at if you have further interest.
I guess I'm confused because Mr. Cost was so thrilled about his picture of trillium and you're painting a different portrait of trillium.
Well,
Right,
can I just give you a little background on the Arboretum? What I don't think very many people realize is the Calder started in 2014. And we removed 44 deer from adjacent to that very spot. I shouldn't say we. There is a private, there's a subdivision that has a park there, a preserve, right next door to that very spot. And they removed 44 deer in 2014 and 15 and 16, that total. It's crazy how many deer. And then the call started for the city, and the ARB was part of it. We removed 36 deer for a total of 80 deer from the Arboretum. Now, the Arboretum is 120 some acres, so that's a lot of land. But where those pictures are, it's the part of the Arboretum that's adjacent to this preserve. So altogether, 80 deer, and so the call really started in 2014. So that's a 6-year. So I started seeing trillium in 22. That's 8 years later. From the beginning of that period. So it's an outlier. It's an outlier because it was longer and more concentrated. Jacqueline, your comments about how fast the deer grow can, within 7 years. So within a few years, that population, when you look at the 2009 picture to the 2016 picture, that's 7 years. And you said a deer can go from 6 to 200, and that at the George Reserve, and that study was repeated. So
Right.
I thought that was pretty interesting, and it made me think about that very site where 80 deer were removed. And so maybe it takes a while. But that was a lot of deer removed there. So I just wanted to give some clarification on a little background on that particular site. It's maybe different from the others in terms of the length of time and the number of deer.
And not to add too much to the complexity, council member, but the two sites with the highest blooming rates, and the Arboretum was one and Mary Beth Doyle was another. Those two sites are much richer. The soils are moister. They have very different soils. Bird Hills is a drier site characterized by a different set of plants indicating that dryness. And so there's very likely some aspects of this that have to do with the kind of site which are leading the recovery to be slower at Bird Hills.
Okay, Chris Graham?
I have a number of comments, but I thought I might shed perhaps a little light on the wildflower issue in Bird Hills, having worked now more than 4 decades out in the field in Ann Arbor. That probably was the first quadrant of the city and one of the prime spaces that deer came into Ann Arbor, probably about the mid-1970s. Whereas deer came into the Arb in the mid-2000s, having not been there for decades, many decades. So the propensity of Trillium not to come back very fast when they've been repeatedly browsed is probably due to the fact that deer being there much longer than other parts of the city, as well as Jacqueline's notion that there are, that at least for Trillium, Bird Hills is not as attractive a spot as other places in the city, other native forest fragments, other parks. Thank you.
Hey, Macy?
I'm sort of curious about sort of how when it comes to like promoting the livelihood of native plants within different like forest ecosystems throughout Ann Arbor, how does sort of like controlled burns how does that compare to like do they have similar effects to like the deer call, or how does those controlled burns how do they affect the deer population as well? Sort of elaborating on sort of where those two different efforts intersect.
So maybe I could take the fire on the plants and Jacqueline could talk about the deer impacts. So fire releases lots of nutrients out of the dried plant material. So generally what you have is increased flowering. And lots of studies have borne this out, increased flowering. Those plants usually grow bigger because there's more nutrients. It's like, like Miracle-Gro. And then they produce more flowers and they produce more seeds. They grow bigger biomass, more seeds. So it generally is really good for the native plants. Timing is important because if the plants have already started to grow and then the burn comes through, then it will knock them back. They'll typically grow back and there'll be some flowering, but they'll be reduced that year. But it can be really good for plants. It just depends on the timing. It won't generally kill the herbaceous plants, but you'll get increased flowering, increased growth, and that's generally, that's great for insects and for anybody that's eating the plants and the plants themselves. So, and I'm not sure, Jacqueline, if you want to address deer.
Yeah, I'll do that. So we haven't done comprehensive studies in Ann Arbor of the impacts of fire on deer, but my guess is the fires that we have in Ann Arbor City Parks are really quite small in area and probably don't have a large impact on deer. Deer can easily get to other parts of the park and use resources there until the plants regrow. I will say, and this is something I've wanted to experiment on for a long time, but I haven't found a good site to do it. One of my big concerns is it's really not either or. These things interact. And if you have a burn and you now have a big flush of flowers and fruits, and maybe you've even flushed some things out of the seed bank that are emerging and blooming for the first time in many years. And if you haven't controlled your deer population and now deer come through and browse a lot of those flowers and prevent those fruits and seeds from setting, my concern is that you might inadvertently exhaust your seed bank if the deer are at high numbers. I've been searching for places to test that experimentally, and I haven't found that yet, but that's just a supposition. I'm not sure we can really compare the effects of deer management versus prescribed burns and which is better. I think an integrated management approach has to really look at both approaches and weigh where they're needed and when, and look at the timing and look at the interactions. So it's really not either or, it's both and.
Yeah, thank you for that. I was just sort of thinking, I don't know if you're familiar with like the Pioneer Woods area, but I know they do controlled burns there every year. And then there's also a really big deer issue. So I was just thank you for explaining that. And yeah.
Yeah, I was starting to do a little pilot project there, but I didn't have funding so I just ran out of resources. But yeah, Pioneer is a really interesting example. Thank you for raising that.
So I guess either one of you can answer this question. So I'm the park steward out of Bird Hills, and when I go out and walk around and I look up, I see maples all over the place. And I see a very dense canopy covered It's for oak regeneration. Do we need to address both deer population and canopy coverage? Will one alone be enough?
I think you'll need to do both. I think the maples are not going to allow much oak regeneration. So, yeah.
Okay, thanks.
And Brooks, as you know, it's notable. The moment you walk under the oaks, you can tell the density of the shade, and it's easy to take a light meter on there under those canopies and confirm it,
Yeah, there's very little light that makes it to the ground.
especially in that Bird Road area.
Yeah.
So
So-
isn't Bird Hills, because of its north-facing topography, more likely to have beech and maple in it than almost any place else in the city? We understand the other side of the river in Barton Hills, it's seriously an oak native forest fragment. But I've always felt that there was a much more damp environment in Bird Hills, and that the species of trees there did include maple, especially sugar maple, and not as many, it's certainly not dominated by oak. Maybe when the Indians were here, they took fire through there and there would have been more, but
I think you're right on the north facing slopes. There is considerable diversity though when you get to like the corner of the park near Newport
Right.
Road, that
Got it.
section, you
can
have
some.
white oak and even black oak in that area, depending on the slope and the steepness. And again, those are higher and drier soils. So I agree with you. In some parts of the park, moister and more likely to have the richer site species.
So it still includes trillium, and there were a lot of them when I was young.
Along Huron River Drive in the early 90s, it was carpeted. I remember
Yep.
driving Huron River Drive the first time in the spring and just being amazed.
Yep.
I see
Rita?
Rita. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Hi. Well, I've got two things. I want to say that just my constant observation of the Chinkapin oak in West Worcester Park, I think demonstrates the light issue in that it's a huge oak tree that is at the edge of a forest, and within the forest there are absolutely no seedlings of oak. And on the edge of the forest where it's in the light and exposed, there have been over 100 oak seedlings that came up over time, and quite an impressive group. So I think just demonstrating the light issue. But my question had to do with your observations of invasive plants with respect to deer populations. And I'm thinking of places where I've seen a lot of Japanese barberry, for example, and just what I'd like to hear a little about perhaps your observations of the relationship of invasive plants versus deer in a particular area.
Okay, thank you. And Rita, thank you for bringing up the Chinquapin oak, that's actually a fabulous example, not just of light, but that's the only park that I've been in Ann Arbor where you don't see deer impact. It's such a small park and so far away from other parks. And I think that really has contributed to the fact that that's some of the best oak regeneration and there's a small part of the Arb that's been managed with fire, and there's a small part of the Foster Road Savanna that's been heavily managed with fire where I see comparable numbers of oak saplings, but that Worcester Park, I think because of the lack of deer and the light, the oaks are doing well. So deer and invasive species are a complicated interaction. And the monitoring that I did in Ann Arbor was not focused on that. I've done other research on it. Deer are generalist browsers, and unlike insect specialists, they will browse on invasive species. They will browse quite heavily on autumn olive, for instance, which is not big in most of our city parks. But autumn olive is a nitrogen fixer and is primed for fast growth. And if you come back even 2 or 3 months into the growing season, deer are browsing it heavily in February and March. Autumn olive grows so fast that like the new shoot will bend around the browse stem, so you can't even see that it's been browsed. It just manages to do really well, I think, because of that nitrogen fixing. Other plants that get browsed, like honeysuckle, they don't seem to browse the mature growth, but if you have cut honeysuckle back and it's resprouting, they will often browse heavily on the resprouts. And similarly, privet can be heavily browsed. However, all of those invasive species are doing well, partly because they arrived here without the suite of insect specialists that do a lot of damage, and often without the diseases that might also set them back. So even if deer are doing some browsing on them, it's typically not enough to truly control them, except in limited cases. So again, it's not either or, it's both and. You have to manage invasive species, but you have to be thinking about deer at the same time, because they can go hand in hand. Deer are known to be long distance dispersers of a number of invasive species because they can eat the fruits and they don't fully digest all of them. And so they can poop them out at long distances. Barberry is an interesting example because in places where I've assessed that, deer barely touch it. They will eat a branch tip here or there. In forests where I was seeing damage levels of 50 to 75 to even 90% of the twigs of all the native shrubs and trees being browsed, fewer than 5% of the twigs of barberry were being browsed. So they're really not eating it. There does seem to be a pretty strong link between areas where there are a lot of deer and areas where barberry comes in. I think some of that might be due to soil disturbance. Deer, when they're really dense, are doing a lot of trampling. Barberry is bird dispersed. Those bird dispersed seeds fall into those trampled areas and they seem to do well there. That's speculation, but that because I consistently see barberry in the heaviest deer areas, like for instance, Skyline Woods. If you want to go into a heavy deer browsed area in Ann Arbor with a lot of barberry, Skyline is a great example for you. And there are some examples in the literature, Rita, of a link between barberry and Lyme disease, presumably because of the deer hanging out by the barberry and bringing the ticks into those areas. I'm not sure if that's fully answered your question.
I was thinking that the deer, well, I guess you did answer it. Thank you. I'll just stop there. Thanks.
Thanks.
So Jacqueline, you mentioned that for the monitoring, you did 15 sites for oaks, 5 for Trillium, 5 for wildflowers. Were there multiple enclosures in each one of those nature areas, or is it one enclosure for each one? How was that
So
done?
it was 5 pairs of enclosures for the wildflower and the Trillium sites because replication is really important.
Right.
Most studies in parks are just 1 or 2 exposures, and I wanted to make sure that I could do some statistical analysis on these plots.
Okay. And the studies, the monitoring was 2015 to 2020 or 2017 to 2020 for wildflowers, but a lot of your charts for the impacts to the individual nature areas was just 1 year. So I'm wondering why that 1 year, or did you pick that year for a certain reason or for all the years consistent?
The trend data is really complicated to look at, and I think is best done site by site. I chose to focus on single year for simplicity for the purposes of the presentation tonight. I'm happy to go through the site by site step through of the trend data. It's just, it's really pretty complicated.
Okay, thanks.
I have
Councilmember
a question.
Brackman?
This is Commissioner Gruber.
Go ahead, she can go.
Go ahead, Bridget.
Thank you. Thank you all for being patient with me as I'm taking this call. I'm taking this on the phone. But thank you both, Jacqueline and Mike. This is a really excellent information, and I hope community members see this. I have a question, I think maybe for Jacqueline. You mentioned that there are other communities, local communities that are managing deer, particularly in Oakland County. Can you tell us a little bit more about how they're managing deer in those communities? And then if you can answer this, I don't know if you can, I know you're an ecologist. If you have a sense of what the community's response or has been to those that management, how has the community supported or responded to the methods that they're using in those communities?
So I regret that I don't know enough about those situations to fill you in on community response, other than that I know Southfield has done a community-wide survey. In fact, there was a Metro Detroit survey that was done about a year and a half ago. So Southfield has surveyed their residents and they've had some public meetings, but I have not seen the results of that survey. Those communities have used a variety of methods. The Oakland parks and the Metro parks have used a combination of sharpshooter culling at some parks, but they've also done controlled hunts at some of the more distant parks where they invite hunters to apply and they do a screening process, and then they close the parks and they allow hunting during a limited number of days. And sometimes that has been, I think more typically that's been done with archery. I know that Bloomfield Hills has been exploring partnering with archers even in other parts of the city, but I don't know if they have fully established that program yet. I have heard details about some of these programs, but I really haven't been able to spend a lot of time to keep up on what every community is doing. But that's the perfect question for Chad Stewart, the DNR deer specialist, who is convening the statewide Deer Management Advisory Commission and is also the person who's advising all of these communities on deer management. Because, for instance, many members of the public would like to suggest that we do deer population control with birth control drugs. And Chad will point out to you that DNR does not permit the use of birth control drugs in Michigan at this time in any free-ranging population because of concerns about the safety of the meat should it be consumed. So if you want further details about who is doing what, I really think the best information would either be from Chad for a statewide overview, or I'm happy to supply you with contact information that I have for some of these communities who are doing it.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
So, Mike, you mentioned that the ARB has been doing a deer call or had done one, but Horner Woods has not. And I'm wondering why the difference.
So the Arboretum was included in the city of Ann Arbor's deer call.
Okay.
During 2016, 17, it was 17, 18, 19, and 20. The Horner Woods, we haven't done a call there. And so it just hasn't been done. No one's ever, gone about trying to reduce the deer population there. And it's a long time, and it's about a 500-acre area when you take Marshall Park and the county preserve with it. So it's a big area. It goes from Plymouth Road all the way to M14.
Mm-hmm.
So, that's a lot of area and has a big population of deer, and we just haven't done it. And so the university hasn't gone about trying to control deer. It's that we just cooperated with the city in the past.
So for deer, is there an acceptable number of deer per acre?
So the concept of carrying capacity has been used in wildlife biology, but it's important to remember that that's a single species perspective. Like typically carrying capacity is used to say, how much food will the ecosystem provide for the deer? But what's carrying capacity for deer may not be carrying capacity for the trillium, or more properly, you would say tolerance for the trillium. The number that DNR used to say was 10 to 15 or 15 to 20 deer per square mile. They do not offer any recommendations anymore. They sort of step back and say, you know, there's biological carrying capacity, there's social carrying capacity, there's what the people will tolerate, what the ecosystems will tolerate, and we have to make a decision. So they just don't make a recommendation. And I should point out too that, you know, you can reduce deer numbers, but if you have a few deer that are constrained in a very small area so that they're browsing repeatedly, they can still have strong impact. So it really, there's not one magic number. It really depends on the context. It depends on how much area the deer have to roam and so on.
Thanks. Chris Graham?
There were once two islands that were, one was a hunt club and the other is now part of Sleeping Bear Dunes National Lakeshore. The North Island had a population of deer imported to it, and there were no trillium. The South Island never had any deer. The currents around those islands are so difficult that the deer can't get there. There were trillium nearly waist high the last time I was on South Manitou Island. And the clear explanation was deer browse for why the difference between the two islands. And many other wildflowers fall into that dichotomy. Chicago Forest Preserve did research across their whole belt of native forest fragments west of the city, using trillium as an indicator species, that is, say, using the height of trillium, how tall they grow, as an indicator for deer density. And they concluded after many years of watching this that 12 deer a square mile allowed trillium to be about a foot tall. As Jacqueline says, our native forest fragments are much smaller and our conditions are much more specific, and we'd have to work way harder in order to get trillium 1 foot tall across the city. I'd like to say also that you had a group, we had a group in the city. I was part of it. Jacqueline was part of it, called Washtenaw Citizens for Ecological Balance. They developed a website that went deeply into the matter of deer, not just here, but throughout the country. And there, just about any question you might want to ask about deer management, you'll find answers to in that website. I will get a link to Erin and get it out to you. It's very helpful. One of the blazing efforts in the country was done at Cornell University in New York. And they've been through every type of deer management exercise that you could possibly go through in a research setting. And so there's very high documentation. Lastly, I'd really like to thank Jacqueline and Mike. You are the current generation of absolutely wonderful natural scientists at the University of Michigan. There's so many people that preceded you: Ed Voss, Richard Robler, John Beeman, Bert Barnes, Herb Wagner, who informed the Natural Features Committee when we first got going 25 years ago about native forest fragments and the extent to which they are still here in our town and still important for our biodiversity. What we worked for beginning 25 years ago applies even more today as the pressures on these places increases, not least because of deer. Thank you both. I'm so excited that you're here.
Thank you. And I certainly owe a lot to Bert Barnes and Herb Wagner. I wouldn't be here today if it weren't for them.
Oh, yeah.
All right. Well, thank you.
Yeah. Does anybody else have questions?
I have a photograph of my grandfather standing beside a deer exclosure. I think it's in the George Reserve. I think it's in the late 30s. He looked about 40. And the field around him was eaten down, and the deer exposure, which was a pretty large one, probably 50 feet each way, had big trees growing up out of it. That whole experiment that was done at the George Reserve decades ago really proved the point way back then about the problem deer can create.
Chris, I would love to get that photo. I tried to rediscover those fences. They were put in the 40s and 50s, and I had a vague map and I tried to find them, and I found remains of one of them, but it was long gone. So I'd really love to see that photo.
It's in my granddad's book about Aspen.
Great.
I'll see if I can copy it somehow and get it to you.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Thank you both. Lots.
Yeah, thank you. Does anybody else have questions? We all. Okay, well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
So I think our next topic is discussing whether the Environmental Commission wants to participate in the Mayor's Green Fair on September 20th. And if so, I mean, it seems like it would be appropriate, but it's kind of late notice, and we probably need at least 2, maybe 3 people who are interested in doing it. Any thoughts? Maisie?
Would we be tabling the event?
That would be the idea, yes. Then the question is, do we have a table skirt? Do we have a tent? Do we have something to present? Things like that, so. And depending on which side of the street you're on, you want a tent if you're on the wrong side of Main Street and you're in the sun for a few hours.
Yeah. Is the Environmental Commission as a whole going to be there, or that's what you're asking? We're not in the
Well,
meeting.
as a whole, no, I don't think we all, but we need at least 2, preferably probably 3 people to do it, because I don't think anybody wants to do it for all 3 hours without taking a break.
And what would be the theme of our, and what materials might we hand out? And
All good things to discuss. I don't know yet. That's probably putting it on the agenda to talk about.
September 20.
Dharma?
Can you provide some context for the invitation or how this kind of came up? That might help frame it.
Steve Brown brought it up. He said the Environmental Commission went to it a few years ago. I was not on it then. And he also, after that, said he's not available to go this year. Yeah.
Aaron, you don't have any information, do you? I guess I'm just wondering. Yeah, I don't.
Sorry, my feed just cut out. What was the
That's okay.
the question?
So Commissioner Curtis brought up having potentially a table at the Mayor's Green Fair. And it sounds like Commissioner Brown is the one that kind of brought it up, that we did it at one time. And I was just trying to understand the context, like, were we invited? Is something going to be provided? Or I just,
Well,
'cause I
can
think
tell you,
I do think it's too late to start from scratch, you know. We were
I
like,
can tell you, since I'm on the Elizabethine Fund, we went to it last year and had a table and handed out tree cookies for little kids to color. And we tried to explain to people what the Elizabethine Fund, or what it does in the city, because most people haven't heard about it. We also tried to recruit more members, but that didn't actually work all that well, that part, but we tried.
okay, thanks.
Rita?
I just have to say, I'm not available, but I will be at a different table at the Green Fair. It seems like we certainly would have to have materials available, something to present, or perhaps the suggestion, a simple survey of some sort that might be useful, but knowing that it's a select group of people who attend that particular thing. So it wouldn't be any scientific kind of thing.
Councilmember Dish?
Yeah, I think I'm echoing Rita here that, or I'm sorry, Commissioner Mitchell, that we would need to have something to present. So, a survey. Shall we kill deer or not? No, not a good idea. But if we had something else that we wanted to know, just kidding for anyone who's watching, I love deer. The other thing is we could offer some information, for example, about the pollinators, unless that's being done at another table, but that's certainly something that we support all, what it really is now that it's not no mow May anymore, and how you develop a pollinator friendly lawn. We could do something like that. That would be, but my sense is that we don't have a whole lot to offer necessarily. So it may not be, and I will already be there leading around a German-speaking visitor, so I can't volunteer for this.
Maisie?
Yeah, I would just like to third that. I'm planning on going to represent the 2030 Washington district for some time, but I would be willing if materials or like a table or like a survey were provided, I would be willing to go for part of the fair to represent the commission.
Okay, thanks. And just one thing we could do is make like trivia questions that for people to answer, what's the most pollinator friendly native plant, and give them 3 choices. Then, if they get it right, give them a piece of candy or something. There's some ways to do things like that that can engage the public, but survey questions would also be useful, or we could talk to them about the pollinators website, things like that.
I'm wondering if, since it seems like a lot of people can't really be there to table it, and honestly, if we had a table, I'm not sure like what type of information we would really present. But since we are part of the city of Ann Arbor and like connected to the mayor, would it be possible if we maybe had like a QR code or a flyer with a survey that we could hand out to all the people that are there? So then like at every table, there is a chance for people to like take the survey from the different organizations that are there, since we are part of like sort of like the more government side, I guess. That's just an idea.
Councilmember Dish?
We could also, rather than develop our own content, we could support Jenny Petoskey, who I bet will be there doing a circular economy tabling. She's done that before. She has the circular economy map. She has a game that she plays, like, what would you do with this thing? Would you throw it out? Would you try to donate it? Would you repurpose it? She has some fun stuff, and I'm sure that she would appreciate support. So if anyone had been thinking about going to the Green Fair and would be willing to help her at her table for half an hour or an hour, that might be a nice thing. And then we don't have to develop content. And that is, that's part of under our purview.
Right. No, that sounds good. I'll reach out to her and see what she thinks. Anybody else have comments on the subject?
Yeah,
I'll
I'll
just
just
say-
echo, I'll be out of town that week, so I will not be able to help, though it's a really great idea. I think it's, A plus.
And I just want to say that I appreciate Councilmember Dish's suggestion on the pollinators and turfgrass, and maybe this is something we could think about for next year, to develop something that would be part of our messaging that goes forward for the projects that we have in mind.
Yeah, I agree. I think so. Okay. So next is reports on committees, work groups and things like that. So first one's biodiversity, and I'd say we did have a meeting earlier this week, and for sustainable landscaping, we're talking to Mathi Botanical Gardens about potentially hosting a workshop, and Bridget Gruber has volunteered to be the single point lead for us on that. We don't have commitment from Mathi yet, but time frame would be probably February 2026. So there's still time for that. It's out there. We talked about doing some work on stormwater management and maybe getting us some groups from U of M to do some research on that. And I had sent an email to Sean Reynolds to send to Jennifer Lawson to see if they would be interested, the city would be interested in supporting something like that. We talked about it a little bit last year, but we didn't really get it together in time just to do anything with the city staff. And Anya Dale has offered to be the point person for that. We talked a little bit about the U of M's high-speed connector and going through the ARB, and the section that is going through the ARB, just so everyone knows that it's definitely a city nature area that goes through. It's city property, not U of M property where it's going through. But we really think it's probably a little premature to do anything with that. And there's supposed to be an update from U of M sometime in the fall on that. So we will wait until after that to see what comes up and then go from there. And we talked about an idea of having educating homeowners on invasive species, and I sent an email to Sean Reynolds to see if that's something OSI would be interested in. Anything else from the biodiversity work group?
It was a good meeting.
Yeah, and we finished in an hour, which was good. Circular economy, Steve is not here this week, but he did send me his update. They did have a meeting this week. It was attended by Steve, Sarah Mason, and Jennifer Pertosky. They set up a schedule for regular monthly meetings. It'll be the third Wednesday from 9 to 10. I haven't seen anything come out on a calendar invite for that yet, but I assume it'll come. They talked about their 2024, 2025 goals to contribute to Washtenaw County Materials Management Plan as requested by Councilmember Jen Cornell and Sarah Mason, and also to work on publicizing some SMART goals for the 82morelife.com campaign, which I wasn't familiar with until I looked up that website. And that's it for circular economy. Water quality, Sarah, do you have anything?
I do. Yeah, so we had our first meeting about 2 weeks ago now. And we developed a mission statement for our group. And we also established 4 goals, SMART goals. So we want to identify and evaluate waterways impacted by road salt and work with the Public Works Department and city to discuss the results of that and then discuss road salt and strategies. We want to review stormwater code, just chapter 33 of our city code, and compare to policies in a few different cities with different size, climate, and politics. And then we're going to summarize the differences and evaluate any policy, any different policies different from Ann Arbor that may be beneficial. We have some goals related to collaborating with different entities. One of them is the Middle Huron Partners Group to support actions that address E. coli in the Huron watershed and nutrient exceedances. So for that goal, me and Steve actually attended the Middle Huron Partners Group meeting that was, I think, last week. And that was really interesting. So they talked about efforts they're doing to advertise the Adopt a Drain program. So if you guys aren't aware of that program, it's essentially you can adopt a storm sewer and keep it clean from leaves and things, and that helps prevent phosphorus from getting into the watershed. So that meeting was really interesting, and we were able to connect with the Huron River Watershed Council, and one of their staff is going to serve on our water quality work group. So that was really positive. Yeah, so that's mostly it. Our next meeting is Tuesday from 1 to 2.
Thank you.
Mhm.
So moving on to other commissions for energy, John Mursky sent me his information. So I'm going to kind of scan through this because it came from John. It's long. The city has contracted the consulting firm Stantec to provide technical assistance on a citywide network geothermal. including feasibility study for 3 representative neighborhoods. Both city staff and Stantec made presentations to the commission and then asked for input and answered questions. The Legistar should have the city's RFP if you are interested in that. The study will be built on the Bryant Neighborhood Geothermal Engineering Study being done using DOE grant funds. The cost of the new consulting services is about 690,000, we think. There's a general comment that the representative neighborhoods probably won't represent every neighborhood in the city of Ann Arbor because we have more than 3 types of neighborhoods, but it's what we have the money to do at this point in time. The potential for wastewater heat recovery will be looked at as part of the study. There was no mention in the RFP or presentations about how the implementation of network geothermal might affect the city's natural features, including trees. So John requested this be taken into consideration and reported on. John also said that the U of M PCCN contracted geothermal study estimated 20,000 wells for U of M. So the city would probably need 20 to 40,000 wells. Let's see, also the city released, changing to a different topic, city released and posted its 2023 greenhouse gas inventory, and there's a link for that, which maybe Aaron, we could just send John's email to everybody for the link. There did show a drop of emissions of 1% from 2022 to 2023, and let's see, the increase was almost entirely attributable to improvements in cleanliness of DTE's electric power fuel, moving away from coal to cleaner fuels like renewable and natural gas. He's also noted that the 2023 inventory does not yet reflect the negative impact of many of the new natural gas connected developments that are not yet occupied. So that's it for energy. Is there anything from planning? No. Parks is a no. Transportation? We don't have anybody on transportation, do we? Okay. Council?
I don't know. Do you think there's anything specific to Environmental Commission, Councilmember Ackman?
Not that's popping to mind. No.
To me neither.
Okay. Chair report, one thing that's different, I got contacted by Ben Kronk, who's roughly my counterpart in Plymouth. He reached out and we chatted for an hour and just compared what our 2 commissions are doing and not doing. One thing that he told me about, there's a nonprofit in Plymouth called Creating Habitats for Pollinators, which is offering to help city put in native wildflower parks in city parks and schools and things like that. So I sent that information over to Give 365, Washtenaw County Parks, and at least one of the schools. And I know Washtenaw County Parks has contacted them to see if they can work something out. Also, and Rita Mitchell let me know about that Parks is having asset management planning meetings, which is really about their capital replacement program. They had a meeting yesterday at Fuller, and they've got one next Monday afternoon at West Park. You can find it on their website, or Rita might have found it on Nextdoor because there's a Nextdoor meeting on there. But a lot of it is talking to the public about where they have the large capital improvement projects, like West Park with the band shell, Fuller with the pool, Vets with the ice rink. How do they do it, and what the impact would be to the public? But you know, they're not looking at trees, but even though trees are probably an asset, they're definitely not a capital cost. But if you want to go talk to them about trees, they'll be there. And Josh Langenfeld was there yesterday, so it was a nice chat for a little bit. And you're welcome to do that. Rita, you have your hand up?
Yes, I just want to suggest that the issue of the street lighting is sort of an environmental issue relating to dark skies, quality of life, sleep, and just the environment in general. So although that Paston is moving forward, there's still quite a bit of work I think that needs to be done to implement it as intended. Just want to raise that.
Thank you. Councilmember Ackman?
I just wanted to say, I don't know how I forgot that one. So thank you, Rita. because it consumed so much of the better part of a month. Also just wanted to mention, because you did, Commissioner Curtis, about connecting with someone from Plymouth. I had someone from a suburb of St. Louis reach out to me. They're an alderman on a council, and they're interested in implementing a gas-powered leaf blower ban, and heard about ours. So I don't know, kind of cool to see possible influence to other
Mhm.
communities.
Yeah. So next item is, and do we have items for next agenda or requests for future agenda items? And Sarah, you're going to work on something from the water side for the next meeting?
Yeah, I think that's the plan.
Okay,
Yeah, we'll talk about it on Tuesday.
I'm sure you'll figure it out. Let's see, our next meeting is September 26th. And I think we're back to public commentary. So this is an opportunity for people to speak for up to 3 minutes. Please call 888-788-0099. Enter meeting ID 962-0336-6543. To raise your hand, press 9. To unmute, press *6. City staff will select callers based who have raised their hand by using the last 3 digits of your phone number. When speaking, please move to a quiet place. State your name and address at the beginning of your comments. There may be a delay up to 30 seconds before a connection is established. Aaron, do we have any callers?
No, we do not.
Okay. Is there anything else people want to talk about? If not, is there a motion to adjourn the meeting? Say one. Is there a second? Do you have a second? Okay. Thanks, everyone. Talk to you next month.
Thank you.